Welcome back to our Unity Roguelite tutorial series. In the last episode, we implemented a melee combat system, giving our player the ability to attack other entities that use their health system. Today, we're going to be taking things to the next level by adding a ranged attack system. Let's get started. First, let's create our projectile. In Unity, we're going to go ahead and right-click in our hierarchy, select 2D object, and then we're going to select a sprite. You can use any sprite that you'd like. I'm going to just use a square for now. And I'm going to go ahead and rename this to projectile. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and change the projectile sprite to be an actual projectile. So I'm going to go into my sprites folder and grab my projectile sprite. So I'm going to use this arrow and I'm going to go ahead and put it right here on our sprite. That's going to change your sprite. And then we're going to go ahead and scale this down so it makes more sense sizing for our player. So I'm going to go ahead and probably do about 0.6. Let's look at that in the game view. Yeah, that looks correct. So we'll do 0.6. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish setting up the projectile. So first, we're going to need to add a rigid body 2D. And this is going to make sure that we can actually detect collisions. And we're actually going to use it to move the projectile as well. So let's go ahead and make sure that the body type is dynamic. We'll set our gravity scale to 0. And then we're going to change our constraints to freeze rotation on the Z. Okay, so with that done, let's go ahead and collapse that and we'll add a collider 2D. So I'm going to use a capsule collider 2D. And you'll see that we've got a circle right now. But then we can go ahead and expand the capsule collider 2D and we'll go ahead and we'll change the direction from vertical to horizontal. And then I'm going to go ahead and edit it by clicking this button. And we're just going to drag our capsule collider to be about the size of the arrow. Okay, so with that, we're going to also make sure that it is a trigger because that's going to allow us to make sure that we're being able to detect that we've hit something, but also make sure it doesn't like stop moving once it's hit something. We're going to delete it right away, so it's not going to like just keep going, but it'll give it a little bit smoother of a look. Okay, and then lastly, we're going to go ahead and create our projectile script. So our projectile script is going to be what makes our projectile function. So let's go ahead into our scripts and head into our combat system folder. And then let's go ahead and create our projectile. So we'll go ahead and create a mono behavior script. And I'm going to call it projectile. All right, and then we'll go ahead and double click on it to open it. So now that we've got this open, let's go ahead and create the code that's going to make our projectile function. So in our combat system, Okay, so now that we've got that open, let's go ahead and just delete the start and update functions. And let's start fresh from our blank class here. So the first thing that we're going to do is define some variables that will help us define our speed of the projectile. So that will help us fine tune how it looks in the inspector. And then also we're going to need to know how much damage that this projectile does. So we'll make sure that we have that. And also which layer that this projectile is going to work on. So this will work just like how our melee attack worked, where we set enemies for our player and it's only going to attack on the enemies layer. So it'll be the same thing for our projectile. And then we'll also get a reference to our rigid body 2D because we're going to need to use that in order to move our projectile. So let's go ahead and create a public float. And this is going to be called speed. Okay, and then we're going to create a public int for our damage. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to set that to 10 as well. And then I'll create a public layer mask. And I'm just going to call this target layers. Okay, so then what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and get our rigid body. So we'll say private rigid body 2D. And then I'm just going to call mine RB2D. And that is all of our variables. So next we're going to go ahead and finish getting our reference set to our rigid body. So we're going to do that in our awake function. So we'll do private void awake. And inside of our awake function, we'll say RB2D. And then we're just going to get the component from ourselves. So we'll say get component rigid body 2D. Okay, so that's set up, and then we will go ahead and create a function that's going to allow us to shoot our projectile. So what we'll do is we'll call that when we're ready to launch it towards, okay, Okay, so now that we've got our rigid body 2D reference, we can go ahead and create a launch function that's going to allow us to launch our projectile at our target once we're ready. So let's go ahead and add that. So we'll say public void launch. And we're going to give it a direction so we know which way we need to fire our projectile in. And then we're going to use our rigid body to add force in the direction, and we're also going to apply our speed. And we're going to do this as an impulse. So it's going to be like one big shock that's going to push our projectile in the direction that we want. And then the speed is going to be like how much force is applied. So this is very much like, think about like how a gun works. If you fire a gun, the bullet is pushed so fast that it just gets going and moves until it's out of the gun and speeding across the air. So let's go ahead and do this. So we're going to go ahead and reference our rigid body 2D here. And in our rigid body 2D, we actually have a function called add force. And our add force function needs to take in a vector 2 for the force that we're going to apply. So this is going to be our direction. And we're going to scale our direction by the speed. And then we're going to say which mode we're going to use, and we're actually going to use a impulse. Okay, so that's going to fire the projectile in the direction that we want, and it's going to do that at the speed that we want. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and create a function where we can kick off this shooting for testing initially. So I'm going to go ahead and add a private void start. And this is just for testing. So that way we can test our projectile before we even add the ability to shoot our projectile from our player. So let's go ahead and just call this launch function. And then let's just say vector2.right for now. So that's going to launch it towards our right direction. And then we're going to need a onTrigger enter 2D function that we're going to add some code to in order to do something once we've hit something. So we'll say private void onTrigger enter 2D. This takes in a collider 2D. Okay, so in the onTrigger enter 2D function, we're going to check if the thing that entered the projectile's collider is on the correct layer mask. A layer mask is a series of bits, so we're going to need to check if the nth bit from the right is a 1. So we're going to go ahead and create a utility class that will allow us to easily check if an object's layer is within the specified layer mask. And we might need to do this a few times, so that's why I want to create a utility script to do this. So inside of our scripts folder, we're going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to call it utility. And inside of our utility folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this layer mask utility.cs. And we'll create a public static class called layer mask utility. Right, and then I'm going to go ahead and just add the using for Unity Engine because we're going to need to be able to check the layer mask, so we're going to need that. All right, so let's go ahead and add a public static bool. And I'm going to call this isInLayerMask. And we're going to pass in our game object that we're checking, and we're going to pass in the layer mask that is our target layer. Okay, so then in order for us to check this, we're going to need to use some bitwise operators in order to do this. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with the number 1, and we're going to shift our current layer. So that's going to be that game object layer. So what that will look like is 1 and then 2 of these less than signs, and then we'll use our layer from our game object. Okay, so that's going to shift this to the correct bit mask for the layer that we're currently on, and then we're going to combine it with our target layer to see if there's any overlap. So to do that, we'll say, and I'm going to add another set of parentheses here. And inside of here, Before the, like after the first parenthesis, but before the second, we'll just say layer map, so target layer dot value. And then we're going to use a single and sign. So this is a bitwise and. So that's going to just combine this value and this value. And if this does not equal 0, so if it's anything other than 0, it means that there is some overlap between the two. And that means that we found that this layer, the game objects layer, is matching to our target layer. So we'll go ahead and use our is not operator, not equal, and we'll say to 0. And then we're going to go ahead and just return all of this. Okay, so this is how we're going to check if our game object has the same layer as the layer that we're trying to hit. So, so this will be useful for the future. Okay, so now that we've got this, we're going to go ahead and head back to our projectile class, and we're going to use this helper class to check if the object has the layer that's contained within our layer mask. Okay, so what we'll type inside our onTrigger enter 2D is first we're going to say if, and then we're going to use our layer mask utility dot is in layer, and then we'll pass in the game object that we hit, and then we're going to pass in our target layer. And I think I called this target layers, plural. Okay, so if this returns true, that means that our layer mask is matching. So this object does exist within the layers defined in our layer mask. So if that's true, we can go ahead and take some damage on whatever we hit. So we'll say other.gameObject.getComponent, and then we'll get our I health. And then if that's not null, we're going to go ahead and take some damage, and we'll just pass in our damage. Then we're going to go ahead and destroy our projectile. So we'll say destroy this dot game object. Okay, so if we hit our enemy, then we're going to go ahead and apply damage, and then we'll destroy ourselves because we've hit them. Okay. So let's go ahead and save our script and head back to Unity to set up our projectile in the scene. Okay, so in Unity, go ahead and click on your projectile, and then we'll drag and drop our projectile script right onto our projectile object. Then let's go ahead and hit play to make sure that this is working. So before we do that, let's go ahead and just select our enemy target layer right now. Go ahead and save. And then I'm going to move my, I'm going to move this like far away so we can see it happening. Otherwise, it's going to hit our enemy really quickly and we're not going to see it. Okay, so now that that's moved over there, let's go ahead and just hit play and we'll see this work. And actually, I need to make sure that our game is pulled over so we can see it, as our player is going to teleport to a new position. So we're not going to be able to see it in the game view. But if we pull them side by side, we can see it in our scene view that what's going to happen. So let's go ahead and press play. And we should see our projectile move, and then when it hits our enemy, it's going to disappear and destroy itself. And it's actually not in the game scene anymore. Okay, so let's go ahead and click save. And we'll need to make sure that we remove the start function from our projectile class. So that way it doesn't do that by default when we spawn it in. So let's go ahead and remove that. Okay, and then let's also make sure that we destroy this game object if it doesn't hit anything. So what we'll do for that is we're going to, in our awake function, we're going to call the destroy function, and we'll say this.gameObject, and then we're going to add a comma. And what it does is it has a second parameter here that allows us to declare the amount of time to delay before we destroy the object. So let's go ahead and create a timeout for our projectile. So that way if like any get stuck or they don't like immediately hit an enemy or something, they will eventually go away and clean up memory for us. So let's go ahead and create a public, and we'll say float. And I'm going to call this timeout, and I'm going to set this to 5 seconds. And I'm actually going to move this up a line just because I want it to be with my other float values. So let's go ahead and put it after our speed. And we'll click save, and then down here in our awake function, we'll go ahead and use our timeout as the amount of time that we'll wait before we destroy this object. So that way, if it doesn't hit anything, it's going to go ahead and just destroy itself. Okay. So next, we're actually going to add some code here that's going to make sure that when we launch our projectile from our player, that it faces the right way. Because like right now, if we were to hit play and be able to launch this, which we can't because we don't have a way to do that, it's only going to launch to the right. But when we turn around, this is going to be backwards. Because even though we're doing a negative scale on our player, it's not applying necessarily to our projectile. So what we need to do is get a hold of our sprite renderer for a projectile and make sure that we call this flip X, so that way it's facing the correct direction. Because with the logic that we have for our attack, we will go ahead and get the correct attack side using the same logic that we used in our melee attack. So it's going to move over here, but it's going to face the wrong direction. So let's go ahead and get our sprite renderer and tell the X to be flipped, so that way it will face the right direction. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to our script. We'll go ahead and add a private sprite renderer. And then I'm just going to call it sprite renderer. And then in awake, before we call the destroy function, we're going to go ahead and set this up. So say sprite renderer equals get component sprite renderer. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and save. And then, okay, so now that we've got our sprite renderer set up, let's go ahead and check before we add force if we're facing our left direction. And if we are, let's go ahead and set our flip X. So we can do this all in one line. We'll say sprite renderer dot flip X, and then we're going to set that equal to direction equals vector2 dot left. And if this is true, then we're going to go ahead and set this to true. And if it's the right direction, we'll say false, and we'll make sure that we're facing the right direction. Okay, so now that we've got that, we can go ahead and get the rest of our stuff set up. So next, we're going to go ahead and create another attack type to handle making ranged attacks. For this, we're going to go ahead and create a new C# script in our combat system, and we're going to call it ranged attack .cs. And then in our ranged attack script, we're going to go ahead and create a public class called ranged attack. And this is going to use our iAttack type interface. And let's go ahead and use our command period or control period to open up our quick fix and go ahead and implement the interface. And then let's go ahead and delete our exception. And inside of this class, we're going to need to know a few things. First, we're going to need a reference to the projectile so we can go ahead and instantiate it. And then we also are going to need an attack offset, just like we did for our for our melee attack. So let's go ahead and add those to the top of our script. And these are both going to be private. So private game object. And I'm going to call this projectile prefab. And then private vector 3, and then I'm going to call this attack offset. Okay, then we'll go ahead and create a constructor so we can set these up. So say public, and then ranged attack. And then we're going to take in a game object, and I'm just going to call this prefab. And we'll take in a vector 3, and I'm going to call this offset. And then inside of our constructor, we will say projectile prefab equals prefab, and attack offset equals offset. Okay, so next we're going to go ahead and add the logic to our execute attack function. So for this, we're going to first calculate where our fire position is. So we're going to create a vector 3. I'm going to call this fire position. But if you remember back to our melee attack, this is going to be the same calculation. So we're going to check if our attacker dot position, and then we're going to add our offset based on which way we're facing. So we'll say is facing left, and then we'll use our question mark. So after the question mark is what if it's true, what do we do? So let's go ahead and return our negative attack offset. And then after the colon it's false, so let's go ahead and return our attack offset. Okay, so then we'll go ahead and launch our projectile. So first we'll need to instantiate it. So we'll say game object projectile, and then we're going to equal this to game object dot instantiate, and we're going to instantiate our projectile prefab. We're going to do it at the attack or at the fire position, and then we're not going to care about the rotation, so we'll just use quaternion.identity. Okay, and then the next thing to do is to launch our projectile. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say projectile.getComponent, and we're going to get our projectile script. Okay, and then if this is null, then this question mark is going to stop it and not try to launch it. But if it's not null, we're going to go ahead and launch our projectile. So then what we'll do is we'll pass in our direction based off our is facing left. So let's go ahead and create another ternary operator. So we'll say is facing left. We'll do our question mark. So if it's true, what do? We will say vector2.left. And then the colon means false. So let's go ahead and do vector2.right. Okay, so that is our ranged attack. And now all we need to do is set it up so our player can use our range attack, and then we'll be able to test it out on our scene. So let's go ahead and save our script. And the next thing we'll do is open up our game manager so we can set up our attack type. So let's go ahead and find our game manager. We'll open it. And then inside of our game manager, we're actually going to create a way that we can choose which attack we want to use just for testing. So let's go ahead and add a public bool up here. And we'll call it use melee attack. And if that's true, we'll go ahead and use the melee attack. So let's create an if statement. We'll say use melee attack. And then we'll cut and paste this from here into the if statement. And then after if statement, we'll add an else statement. And if this is not true, we're going to go ahead and create a ranged attack. So let's go ahead and say player combat dot attack type equals new ranged attack. And then we need to pass in our game object for our ranged projectile. So let's go ahead and create a public game object. And then let's just call this projectile prefab. And we'll go ahead and copy the name of that, and we'll paste it into our constructor. And then we also need to know our attack offset. So let's go ahead and create a new vector3. And then I'm just going to use 0.5f and 0. Okay, so that's going to create our ranged attack for us. So now we can go ahead and head back to Unity and just make sure that our game object, our game manager is set up. And then we can go ahead and try it out. So let's go ahead and click on our game manager. And you'll see that we have some new items on here. So we have our use melee attack. So if this is checked, it's going to use our melee attack instead of our ranged attack. And then we'll need our projectile prefab as well. So let's go ahead and create our prefab. So in our prefabs folder, we'll drag and drop this projectile from our scene into the folder. And then let's go ahead and delete this from our scene. And then on our game manager, we'll drag our projectile into our projectile prefab spot. We'll click save. And then we should be ready to test it out. So let's go ahead and hit play. And then we'll press our attack button to see if we are shooting. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag my game back into the main view here so I can have more of a scene. And then let's go ahead and just press space. And we can see that our projectile is functioning. And then when we go this way, we can see that's facing the right direction. And that's because we updated the sprite renderer. But it looks like we're also playing our melee attack animation when we're performing a ranged attack. And we don't actually want to do that. So let's go ahead and update our melee attack so that this animation is handled within the melee attack instead of inside of our player combat, which is what we should have done all along, but it was a little bit easier for testing to do it the other way. So now that we have a second attack, let's go ahead and fix this. So let's go ahead and open up our player combat. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and remove our melee animator from this. So let's go ahead and remove that. And then we're going to have some issues. So this is now no longer there. So this is causing an error. So let's go ahead and create, just delete the awake function. We don't need that in there anymore. And then we'll remove our reference from our attack function. I'll go ahead and save. And next we're going to go ahead and open up our melee attack. So let's do melee attack.cs. We'll open that. And we're going to add in this logic into here instead of in our player combat. So first we'll create a private reference to our animator. And I'm just going to call this animator, or attack animator. And then we're going to need to take in our animator in our construct. So I'm just going to call that one animator. And then we'll say attack animator equals animator within our constructor. And next, all we need to do is just set our trigger for this attack. So before we debug the position, let's go ahead and just say attack animator dot set trigger. And then we'll say attack. And that's going to go ahead and play our animation for us. So now all we got to do is just give the melee attack a reference to our animator. So let's go ahead and go to our game manager, where we're now going to have an error because we have a third parameter for our constructor that we're not passing in. So let's go ahead and just say player.find, and then we're going to look for sword. And then we'll say get component, and we're going to look for animator. And that's going to pass in our sword animator so we can play our melee animation. All right, so now we're going to need to do something similar for our ranged attacks. So let's go ahead and go into our ranged attack script, and we will add a private animator. And we'll just call this attack animator as well. And then we'll set it up in our constructor. So first we'll need to pass it in. So we'll say animator, and then we'll say attack animator equals animator. And then inside of our execute attack, after we shoot our projectile, let's go ahead and play the animation. So we'll say attack animator dot set trigger, and we'll say attack. Okay, so then we're going to go back to our game manager because now we have an error, and that's because we don't have that third parameter. And we actually don't have a way to get our animator yet because we don't have an object that's set up with an animator. But we're going to go ahead and just fill this out anyway, and then we'll make sure that we set up our animator correctly. So first, we'll add a comma, and then we're going to say player, then we're going to find, and I'm going to call this game object bow, and then we'll say get component, and then we're going to get the animator. Okay, so that's going to resolve our error here, but we currently don't have this object on our player, so let's go ahead and add it now. So let's head back to Unity, and we're going to go ahead and click on our player, and we're going to duplicate our sword. Okay, and then I'm going to rename this to bow. Make sure that it's spelled the same way as our, what we just put in our game manager. So we've got bow here, and then head back to our game manager, and we can see that that is bow as well. So that's the same. This needs to be the same, otherwise it's not going to be able to find it. So let's go ahead and head back to Unity. All right, so now that we have our bow, we do have an animator with a sword controller, and we've got our sword sprite in there. So let's go ahead and change the sword sprite to a bow sprite. So inside of weapons, I've got lots of different bows here. So we're going to use a right-facing bow. And I actually think I might need to fix these because this sprite sheet's not as well put together as the other ones. So these are all different sizes, which means the animation will play weird. So let's go ahead and fix this. So all I need to do is make sure that this one is the same height as our tallest one. And then make sure that it is positioned correctly. So here we go. Let's see. Zoom into here a little bit and just make sure it's like centered. There we go. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this bow right 1, And that's just going to make sure that we get these all in order. So I'm going to delete the automated cut of all these, and then we're going to duplicate this one, and then we're just going to drag it over. Okay, and then we'll duplicate it again, and we're going to drag it over. We're going to make sure it's centered, and then we'll duplicate it again, drag it over, make sure it's centered, and then last one. And then we're going to have to rename all these again, but that's okay. So this one will be right. Let me just make sure I got this right. Bow right 1. So this one will be bow right 2. Bow right 3. Bow right 4. And then last one, bow right 5. And the reason I'm renaming that is so that they appear in the correct order, because like sometimes when you duplicate these, they get out of order and it makes making an animation a pain. Let's go ahead and apply that. And then we can, now these are going to be like slightly a bit smaller. And they're at the top now. Okay, so let's go ahead and just make sure that the bow has this bow right as its animation. And then we're going to go ahead and change this to be smaller so it matches our player size. And now we can go ahead and create our animation and change out our controller. So let's go ahead to our animations folder. We're going to duplicate our sword controller by pressing Command D or Control D, and then we'll go ahead and rename this. On Mac, it's just the Enter key, but on Windows, I think it's F2. So let's go ahead and rename this bow. And then this is going to have some sword animations in here, which we don't want. Let's go ahead and delete these. Okay, and then we're going to drag our bow animator controller onto our bow. So make sure you select that. And we'll go ahead and change out the sword for our bow, which will update our animator window. And now we just got to create our animation. So let's go ahead and open up our sprites, and then those are scripts. That's not our sprites. Here we go, sprites. And then we're going to go ahead and grab our animation. So we'll just make sure we select all the frames in the correct order. Okay. And then we'll go ahead and just drag and drop that onto our bow. And then we'll save it in our animations folder as our bow attack animation. Okay, and that's going to be set as our default inside of our bow animator. But we'll see that our sword and attacks are inside of our player animator. So let's go ahead and just delete those since we don't need them. Sometimes they get added in there. And then on our bow animator, let's go ahead and drag in our idle too. So let's go ahead and just duplicate our sword idle. And then we're going to rename it to bow idle _ animation. And then what we'll do is we'll make sure that this one has a loop time, and we'll make sure that our bow attack does not have a loop time. Okay, so you just click on that in the inspector, uncheck the box. Okay, and then we'll open up our bow animator animation. We'll dock that here, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on the bow. And then since we don't have it inside of our animator, it's not showing up. So let's go ahead and add it to our animator by dragging and dropping it in there. And let's also make sure this is set to our default state. And then we'll move these around. Okay, so then inside of our animation window now, we should have our bow idle. Okay, and now we have this one scene that's in here, and it should just work. So it's just changing our sprite to none. So we actually don't need to fix this. It's already working. So we just need to make sure that that's working. And then we can close that animation, and we can go ahead and set up our transitions in our animator. So we're going to right click on our animator, my idle animation. We're going to make a transition. Okay, let's make a transition, and we're going to transition it to attack. And then we'll make a transition from attack back to idle. And because we copied this from our sword, we should already have our attack trigger set up. So let's go ahead and choose the idle to attack transition. We'll uncheck has exit time, and then we're going to add that attack trigger. And then our second from attack to idle will just be the same. We're not going to make any changes to that. So go ahead and save. And we can close our animator window. So close tab. And now let's just double check everything's set up in the inspector correctly. So we've got our sprite renderer, and we have our animator with the correct animator controller. And we have both of our animations set up in our animator window. So let's go ahead and hit play and try it out. So let's go ahead and hit play. So the first thing is that we don't see a bow immediately. So that's great. That seems to be working. Then we'll go ahead and we'll press the attack button, and we'll see that our bow animation plays and our arrow gets shot. So great work, it's working. So now that we have the basics working, here are some ideas to help you expand on your system. So you could create a new projectile type, like fireballs or different types of arrows that have an effect when they hit our player. And you could also introduce cooldowns or ammo mechanics for balance. So feel free to get creative with it and make the system your own. And that's it for our video. We now have a functional range attack system that complements our melee combat system that we built earlier. So in our next video, we're going to go ahead and create some enemy AI to further enhance our roguelite. If you found this tutorial helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Unity content. Let me know in the comments how your project is coming along or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.